Hi, I'm Malak Fuad, and thank you for joining me on What I Did Next from A&T Media. I welcome a new guest each episode, and we take a deep dive into their personal journeys, exploring the twists and turns their lives have taken to understand what these pivotal moments mean. On today's episode, entrepreneur and investor Ramy Adeeb tells me how important risk-taking has been in his career.
I don't subscribe to regretting, but if there's one thing I regret is not taking enough risks in life.
Wow.
And I've seen founders across my career who are truly are risk takers, and they are willing to take risks at way more frequency than I do. And I think, and they're willing to sort of convince themselves of things that are not true, but then in the process they become true.
Are you as risk conscious or savvy now that you have a family than you were then when you were single and you had no commitments, no responsibility? Or are you now a little bit more conservative?
I do think I've gotten more conservative a little bit with time, but also more appreciative of risk taking. And I also think I've become more aware of the importance of psychology in managing it all.
Ramy Adeeb is the founder and managing partner of 1984 Ventures, a firm that specializes in providing seed funding to startups. Ramy's story is quintessential What I Did Next. Passing through boarding school, Harvard, and Stanford, Ramy went on to have early jobs at Microsoft, working in Silicon Valley as an investor with Khosla Ventures, and launched his own startup, Snip.It, which was acquired by Yahoo in 2013. Ramy offers insights into a world that is often imbued with glamour and power, but is also relatively opaque to someone like me. Ramy's is the story of a boy who grabbed at life when an amazing opportunity presented itself and hasn't let go since. He grew up in Egypt but moved to Canada for high school at the age of 16.
I was born in 1978, so we're talking mainly about Egypt in the late 80s is when I really came of age, and then early 90s. My parents both at the time worked for the government. My father was he had a PhD in engineering and was a lieutenant general al Gauge, and then my mom was a wakil wazara she was an engineer, and she was working for the Ministry of Irrigation. Obviously, Egypt was open to the world to a great extent, right? This was not the 60s. Or the 70s for that matter. You had access a lot to what was happening outside. And my parents traveled a lot for work outside of Egypt. But things were still a little bit closed because this was pre-internet. And so as a child, I always had this imagination of what does the world look like outside of Egypt? I used to collect stamps specifically, which is a very common hobby for Egyptian kids at the time, stamps and coins.
I was a stamp collector too as a child. Yeah, I did it with my dad.
It was such a beautiful hobby because when you don't have an access to the world, you see a stamp, and a stamp is a representation of a country. It says India on it, and you're like, wow, this thing is from so far away, and it has a picture, and it has the picture of King George or Queen Victoria, and why is that? And it teaches so much about the world, and I think as a curious kid, that was definitely a window to the world. And a lot of people in my family, had over years, my uncle, my cousin had went abroad when they finished their undergrad or master's. They would get a PhD. So my uncle, and then lived abroad, and there was all this dream of education overseas for me. But it was really associated with perhaps graduate degrees. I'd never really thought of going to high school abroad. But I really, by a bunch of random coincidence, I learned of this organization called United World College that were giving one student from each country to live abroad together for the sake of promoting international understanding and tolerance. And I at the beginning I thought like maybe the whole thing is a scam, but I really applied to it and was very fortunate to get the scholarship. And that was a story of leaving Egypt.
And you went to Canada?
I went to Canada. And I left Cairo and showed up at a school in the middle of the forest by the ocean with 200 students from 90 countries. It was mind-blowing.
Wow. And how did it feel to be far away from home? How did your parents feel about letting you do that?
My mom, I think it was really hard on my mom. And I told my parents I'm going to apply. And my dad was like, "Oh, sounds great." And my mom was like, "No, you're not going to leave." And then my dad told my mom, look, it's probably the whole thing is a scam. Just, you don't want to stand on his way and just have him have him for the rest of his life say like, I was going to Canada and you like prevented me from going. And so I applied for the first exam and there was like 1,000 people. And then I was very fortunate to get to the second round and there was fewer people. And then the third round, actually, they met my family. And so all of a sudden my parents became part of this. And they got really excited, both rooting for me to win, but scared of me from winning it. And I still remember to this day when my mom, she came in and said, did you hear anything? And I said, yes, I got the scholarship. I remember her saying, Mabruk ya Habibi, and then running to her room, closing the door and crying.
Oh, Ramy,
I know.
that's so touching.
It was probably, to me, it was a moment that tells so much about just a mother's sacrifice, love for her son and sacrifice for him.
That's very touching. So tell me a little bit, how was the experience at boarding school? Did you fit in easily? Was it a struggle? Did you find yourself very different to everyone? Coming out of Egypt, at the age of 16, not having lived anywhere else, what was that experience like?
My God, it was mind blowing. And it puts so many of my preconceived notions about myself and about the world to test. So think about the Egypt I grew up in. There was a sort of a rising tide of religiosity
Yeah.
during sort of the late 80s, early 90s. And the whole discourse is about like religion is at the epicenter of everything. And your identity sort of is shaped by that to a great extent. But then I go to Canada and I'm in this international place and nobody thinks about religion at all. And instead they think about culture, about language, and you find that everybody is Christian. But the person I can relate to the most by far are the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the Palestinians. And these are the people I can speak with, I can relate to, I have a shared culture. And it immediately hits me at that point that identity is a lot less about, what you are and a lot more about what you're not or how you're different from your surroundings. And in Canada, when myself and my closest friend who was Palestinian and my closest friend who was Lebanese, who came from three very different, religious backgrounds in the Middle East, and very different socioeconomic backgrounds, really bonded together because that's sort of what we had in common against this sea of foreignness. The other thing that probably hit me is, again, how ill-conceived a lot of my perceptions of others were. I had never met, an atheist or a gay person, and to meet those folks who had these identities that were so strange to mine really made me question. Just again, it just makes you question so many of your values and so much of what you were taught to believe. But I really loved it, and it was truly a single most defining experience in my life.
And certainly pivotal in the sense that it then propelled you to the next phase, which was going to Harvard. There's this fantastic movie, which you might have seen from the 90s with Gwyneth Paltrow, I think. It's called Sliding Doors, where she glimpses what her life could have been if she didn't take a certain path. And I wonder, we all have those moments. And actually, that's very much the basis of what this particular show is about, What I Did Next. And I wonder, I'm sure you've wondered, if you hadn't gone to that boarding school, would you have had that opportunity to apply for Harvard? Um, you know, these kinds of things I always find really interesting. What was Harvard like for you, and what did you study there?
So I loved computers. I had this incredible. I used to draw computers in my art class. It's a little bit geeky, but that's what I love to do. Well, first I told my dad. Actually, this is a funny story. I told my dad I want to study computer science, and he's like, "بس دي مش بدخل النقابة, like it's not engineering. Why don't you just study electrical engineering?" I'm like, "No, I want to do computer science. It's science." And my dad had the best answer ever. He said, "No, no, no. If it has the word science, like political science, social science, these are not sciences. The real sciences are called physics or chemistry or math." And I love that
Yeah,
line because if you have to qualify it, it's probably
that's
not real.
right. That's right.
I ended up doing computer science anyway. But I was really drawn to all the liberal arts classes. Right? I took classes in economics. I took classes in history. I took classes in music. And I think that liberal arts education is certainly something that really shaped. I mean, obviously, I had an aptitude to it.
Yeah.
right? So since I was a kid, I loved reading, but it really made me thrive.
I think that's where the American university system is at its best, where you go in to do one thing, which is very technical or scientific, and you have the option to study everything else under the sun at the same time. And I think that's so exciting about being in that system, and opens your horizons in a way that, nothing else does. And it's amazing you took advantage of that. And how did that then propel you to your next phase? What happened for you after college?
I had my dream in life was to get a job at Microsoft, right? That was what every sort of Egyptian computer scientist wished. And in my junior year in college, I got my internship at Microsoft, and I went to Seattle and was an engineer working on the Dreamcast and had a great time there. Went back to my senior year, and I was seriously considering joining Microsoft. But then all my friends, and again, this was sort of the immigrant mentality because I had just come to the US, and the idea is you go for the safer job. But all my friends who obviously were, born in the US, a lot more risk willing, were all telling me, Ramy, like, what are you doing going to Microsoft, dude? You should go to Silicon Valley. Like, you're going to become a gazillionaire in no time, and like we're going to work on a startup.
What are
And
we
whatever.
talking here? We're talking like 2002 at this point?
This is 1999.
Oh, so pre-bust.
Pre-bust, exactly.
So the heyday, yeah.
It was the heyday. And so I took a flight to California, and there was one startup that was called Tell Me, that was one of the most exciting startups at the time, that was founded by a bunch of actually Harvard alums. And they were recruiting heavily from Harvard, and they had recruited some of the top students in my class. So I figured this was who I should follow. Um, and I ended up joining this startup, and did not take the sort of the safe job from Microsoft, and instead took the sort of the riskier path. And mind you, obviously I needed a visa, and so I needed a more stable place to work, and so forth. And it was lower pay, but I did get a sense when I visited San Francisco that those startups, those small community of people building something bigger than themselves, there was an entirely different energy, entirely different passion and excitement than what existed at the larger companies.
When we come back in a moment, Ramy tells me how his first venture, Snip.It, came out of the 2011 Arab Spring. Welcome back to my conversation with Ramy Adeeb. Before the break, Ramy was telling me about his move to California to work for Tell Me Networks.
Now, this was at the height of the tech bubble. So what happens next? I come out here in June of 2000, and I love my job. And then within 3 months, the entire tech bubble bursts. There was a massive stock market crash. The valuations were too high. Companies were laying people off left and right. Companies were going out of business. And even I personally, I had, when I first joined the company, I was given these stock options. And in order to buy the stock options, I needed $18,000. So I ended up taking a credit card loan to exercise, to buy
Wow.
these options. But then the stock market crashed, and these options became worth a penny. So literally within 3
Worthless.
months or 4 months, I had $18,000 of credit card debt because I bought $100 worth of shares. And you might think that that would have turned me off against the whole startup ecosystem, but I really think when you get times of bust like this, the tourists leave, but the ones who truly believe stay. I wasn't here because it was a bubble. I was here because I've loved computers, and I loved the internet, and I loved building software, and this was a place to be.
And what was the attraction for you? Was it the idea that you're building something from scratch, or is it the attraction that you're your own boss? Was that part of the attraction, that you're your own? You're not responsible, or you're not answerable to someone else?
No, to me, it was about building, and about the speed with which a startup can operate. So I wasn't a founder of Tell Me. I was a very early engineer.
Yeah.
I joined when it was literally in a garage, classic sort of California story. Um, but then but then we grew to like a few hundred people, and eventually it was acquired by my in a very interesting twist. Uh, Tell Me was then acquired by Microsoft, so I ended up at Microsoft 7 years later, but obviously with an entirely different experience, an entirely different journey.
How did you approach the sort of more traditional corporate environment that Microsoft was? Did you feel that you brought something to the table that you wouldn't have if you had started there as a fresh grad? And did you feel that you outgrew it very quickly because of the previous experience you had?
They kept us as an independent entity. Uh, and because Tell Me was really, we were pioneering sort of voice recognition technology, and they really wanted us to continue to build that technology. So we didn't get to sort of deal with Microsoft corporate much during the first few months. But then after 6 months, I left to go to business school at Stanford, and so I missed. And then the next 2 years, they went through that process. Later in my career, though, I did have a very similar experience where I had started a company, Snip.It, and it was acquired by Yahoo. And then I had to actually transfer a lot of my skills into having a big
Yeah.
job at a very large organization. And that was very much what you're alluding to.
What is the year that you finished Stanford?
2009.
Okay. And what did you do after that?
Well, this was another sliding doors moment where a very well-known investor called Vinod Khosla had come to Stanford to give a talk, and I really liked. And it's funny because he was actually his previous firm, Kleiner Perkins, was an investor in Tell Me, where I had worked for many years, and I really liked his talk. And so on his way out, I just stalked him for a business card and dropped him an email. And then I just went through this process of interviewing with him that took like 3 or 4 months, where I'd go just spend time at the office. He would ask me the most interesting questions and then have me think about them for 2 weeks and come back and answer them. I remember one of the questions he asked me is, "Would you buy a newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicles, which was the biggest newspaper in the Bay Area at the time?" He asked, "Would you buy it for a penny if you could?" And it's funny because obviously newspapers were in decline because of
Yeah.
online media, but it wasn't as obvious as it is today. And then after 3 months, I was very fortunate enough to get the job, and then I joined Khosla Ventures as their first principal, and that was my foray into the venture capital.
And was it at the same time that you did Snip.It, or was that at a later point?
No, that was a later point. So I had a somewhat, I think, maybe different transition than most, where a lot of folks are founders and they become investors.
Yeah.
I was sort of an engineer, and then I was an investor, and I really enjoyed being an investor. But then in 2011, something very interesting happened, which is obviously the Arab Spring.
Yeah.
And at the time, I had been an investor for 2 years. I was investing in companies um, in the US. I was on a number of boards. But when the Arab Spring happened, one thing that really, first of all, it had obvious two effects. One is uh, it made us all excited about doing something different and innovative and new. I had friends who were taking huge risks in Egypt, and I was here in a very safe job because starting a company might be too risky. And so it was sort of a drive for many of us to think about sort of our life's purpose in a sense. But the other sort of thing, that the idea that I saw from the Arab Spring is the role of social media. I think it's often lost that this was truly the first sort of online organization of a mass protest in history, and even reflect about what happened then. If you remember the very first time, El Magnus Laskari issued
A press release.
a press release, they put it on Facebook.
Yeah.
It's kind of mind blowing. Like
Yeah.
Egypt really pioneered the use of social media by
For
government.
sure.
This never happened anywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
And what hit me is how inefficient a lot of there was really no platform here for sharing great articles or great content about interesting topics. People were doing it on Facebook, but Facebook wasn't really built for that. And so I decided to actually start, quit my job and start a company. And that's the impetus behind Snip.It, which was a social media place that allows you to share articles around topics of interest, articles and videos around topics of interest.
And did you do that from the US, or did you come back to Egypt at that time?
No. I sit in the U.S. I sit in the U.S. and it was getting a lot of inspiration from what was happening in Egyptian use of social media, but the platform was mainly used by both Americans and by some people in the Middle East as well.
You're clearly someone who likes risk and cherishes and relishes risk. It's and I think also partly it was your age at the time. You were young and you were trying different things. I mean, to start a job, to leave a job because you want to try something else. I think most people, when they find themselves in a good setup, kind of cling to it and think, okay, now I'm all set. Now I will, settle down or enjoy it or whatever. But they don't necessarily think of, jumping ship again so quickly. But you've done that several times. Is risk a major attraction for you? Is that something you're always looking for, or is it like a subconscious thing that's like, your baseline is risk?
It's funny you say that, Malek, because my perception is actually very different. If there's, I don't subscribe to regretting, but if there's one thing I regret is not taking enough risks in life.
Wow.
There was an element of risk to it, but it was also sort of there was, there was no real
It's
downside to
calculated
many of
risk. It's
these
a
steps.
calculated move.
It's calculated risk, and I've seen founders across my career who are truly are risk takers, and they are willing to take risks at way more frequency than I do. And I think, and they're willing to sort of convince themselves of things that are not true, but then in the process they become true.
Here's another way to look at it. Are you as risk conscious or savvy now that you have a family than you were then when you were single and you had no commitments, no responsibility? Or are you now a little bit more conservative?
I do think I've gotten more conservative a little bit with time, uh, but also more appreciative of risk taking at the same time.
Yeah.
Right, I became more aware, more conscious uh, of risk, and I also think I've become more aware of the importance of psychology in managing it all.
In what sense?
My parents are visiting, and so my mom was binging on Musalsalat Ramadan last night, and I was, I literally just sat next to her working on my laptop, and and during one of the episodes, there's just like, actually I find the scenarios sometimes really really well written. I was watching, this very very profound, and there was just two guys talking to each other in a horror, and one told the other person, اللي تصدق اللي يصدق نفسه تصدق الدنيا. And I was like, oh, that is so profound. That is actually exactly the essence of entrepreneurship, right? It's
Yeah.
having that conviction about things and then sort of turning the wheel of the arc narrative of history to sort of your own vision of the future and what you want to accomplish. And I think some of the best founders I have met, they almost have a loose cannon in their brain, where their assessment of risk is a little bit off, and that's precisely why they succeed.
Yeah. I also think that fundamentally the people who are, from what I can see as an outsider, the people who seem to be the most successful in terms of reaching the heights in their industries tend to be the ones, especially in tech, who have a base of nerdy engineering, who are not just money guys or investors. Or I feel that if you have a base where there is a profound understanding of the tools of your trade, you make those choices that appear risky to the outsider, but are actually very well understood by you, because you understand the underlying foundation of what you're buying or investing in, or that people from the outside may not appreciate as much. It's just an observation.
No, I think that's very valid and it's very
Yeah,
correct.
yeah. So what happened with Snip.It? So that didn't last very long, right?
No, I did that for 2 years, and we were very popular as a social media tool. And then Yahoo came out of nowhere and made us a. Marissa Mayer had just became CEO of Yahoo, and she really wanted to make Yahoo more social. That was probably uh, one of the things. If I was a little bit more risk taking, I'd have probably kept going with the startup instead of selling it. But I saw that opportunity, and I ended up going with the acquisition.
Presumably, you found yourself unemployed after that.
No, Yahoo acquired the Snip.It and asked me to run media, a big part of it with the team. So I ran media.
But did you stay?
I
You
stayed at
stayed
Yahoo for
on
two
and did
years.
that then?
There were golden handcuffs that made it hard to leave,
Okay.
but I stayed for a couple of years.
And why did you move on from there?
It was way too boring and way too stable for me. So
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
you're right. Maybe I do like taking a little bit of
Yeah,
risk after
there's
all.
a risk thing going on here. I'm noticing a pattern, Ramy. There's definitely a pattern. So what happened next for you?
Well, what happened next for me is this was the first time where I did not have a job. So if just think about it. I left Egypt in 1994. This is all the way to 2016, 22 years, where I always had something to do. I always had a very clear next step. I never left something without knowing what my next destination was going to be. and I'd always ran to something. This was the first time in my career when I just ran away from something and not to anything. So I left Yahoo, and uh, it was a very tumultuous, probably year where I had a lot of opportunities, but they all looked wonderful, and but also they all had drawbacks. I didn't know if I wanted to start another company. I wanted to start another company, but I also know just from my experience that it's not just about starting a company; it's also about having a great idea.
Hmm.
And you don't just start a company for the sake of starting a company. This is probably one of my favorite Steve Jobs quotes of all time. If you don't have an idea, go be a waiter.
Yeah, absolutely. And how old were you, Rami, at this point?
It's 37.
I find it interesting that you found. Did you tell me how you felt about having this quiet time? Was it exciting for you, or was it nerve wracking that you had suddenly nothing to do?
It was nerve wracking.
It was nerve wracking.
It was nerve wracking, and part of it is, and it was a great glimpse into what it's a privilege to have that in life by choice, right? Many people are forced to be laid off, or people work their entire career and then retire at 62 and realize that they're depressed and don't know
Sure,
why
sure,
because
sure.
their life was defined by their career. And so it was and I also didn't have a family at the time, which would have been at least a foundation or a time suck, regardless of how you phrase it.
Sure, sure.
And so it was certainly tumultuous. It was very tumultuous.
And what did you do with your time? Were you productive? Did you learn a language? Did you pick up a new hobby? Did you panic? Did you start to panic about what your future was? I mean, what was it like? Tell me what happened to you that year?
All the above. I I worked with a founder on a startup. I almost, I interviewed for a couple of jobs and got the jobs, but didn't take the jobs. I that job one job was like in the U.S. One was to run a business in Asia.
So you were confused. You went through a confused phase.
I went through a very confused phase for a few months, but then at the end of the day, there was a silver lining, right? I loved startups,
Yeah,
and I had been in, and I had been starting to invest in startups and help startups and advise startups, and that was emerging as probably the right,
hmm,
it's sort of the trajectory of my entire life was working with startups. It was just not sure whether do I start one, do I invest in one. There was a couple of VC firms that wanted me to join, but I felt like it was just going to be again like Coleslaw, where it's a firm, and we're coming later investing, and what really also candidly what I love is a 0 to 1.
yeah.
I really love having just working, whether I do it myself or work with someone else to do it, but I really love getting the glimpse of an idea or the kernel of an idea and trying to make it into some form of reality. The idea of a product and then shipping that product and getting in front of the user. And so I think that 0 to 1 was what I loved most. And that's really the story behind where I ended up after that year, which is starting 1984 Ventures.
So let's talk about that. So what was the thinking behind 1984 Ventures? What was the basis of the kind of venture capital firm you wanted to establish?
So to me, I've always wanted to do, I think what I really wanted to do is 0 to 1, which is the very first check that works with founders. Talking about risk is probably the riskiest stage. It's by far the riskiest phase of investment, but it's also the one with historically the best returns. And so I didn't want to do another late stage fund. I also wanted to build something that was sort of my own, that I get to shape with a group of other people, but I get to shape it with sort of how I wish I was treated as a founder, or how I wish I was, what kind of support I wish I had as a founder from my investors, just bringing in that experience.
So much more of a personal human contact.
Precisely, because the venture industry was not, I mean, the venture industry generally happens at later stage, at the Series A and the Series B, and then you have a board. But at the seed stage, there's really no board. And it's not like you're going to replace the founder. But what you want is you want to have a personal connection with the founder so you can truly understand what their challenges are and you can guide them. And that guidance is a function of many things. It's not just about giving advice, it's also about making them believe in their potential. Most founders aren't limited by what they can do. It's more that they're limited by what they think they can do. And to the extent that I can, as an investor, can explain to the founder a bigger vision here, or push them, or help them bring on board, recruit a co-founder, or recruit an executive, that would be a dream, sort of a dream candidate for them.
Do you focus only on the US in your investments, or do you look abroad as well? Are there areas around the world that you're looking at? The Middle East, for example?
We're 80% US, but we occasionally invest internationally. So we have, an investment in Egypt and Cylinder. We've made other investments in Latin America, Blue, but we're 80% US though. So we're primarily focused in the US. We invest, we invest opportunistically internationally when we find founders that we can connect to in industries we really understand, and in partnership with local VCs that we sort of respect and want to work with. And when we see an angle where having a Silicon Valley investor would actually be beneficial, or because we don't want just to be dumb money.
Sure, of course, of course. Ramy, that was great. That was so interesting. And I thank you so much for being on the show. Really, really interesting story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Malak, for having me as a guest in your awesome show.
That was Ramy Adeeb, entrepreneur and venture capitalist investor, telling me about his life's pivot points and how they led him to begin his own purpose-driven VC firm, 1984 Ventures. If you're a member of the show, we'll have a bonus episode next week where Ramy shares more on the volatility of the VC world, his entrepreneurial experiences, and his thoughts on crypto and the metaverse. You can find extended clips from our interviews on our YouTube channel and also connect with us on Instagram, X, and on LinkedIn. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Malak Fuad, and you've been listening to What I Did Next from A&T Media. See you in a couple of weeks' time.